Chapter 1. I teach hypnosis to men in all branches of medicine. Naturally, I use many teaching aids, including recordings, copious outlines, and notes, but I have never relied on any textbook. The idea of writing a textbook of my own on the subject has been suggested to me by physicians, dentists, and podiatrists. Now, finally, I am acting upon the suggestion. Why? An explanation can be found in two communications I recently received while recuperating from a serious illness. The first one was a telegram which came all the way from California. It was from someone I do not know and who has never studied with me. It reads, "Are you going to teach in Los Angeles soon? I'm a psychiatrist. What do you suggest? Sincerely." The second was a letter from a doctor in another field. He lives in Detroit and is a former student of mine. He studied with me about 7 years ago. He wrote in part, "I'm certain that none of the doctors in Detroit who have been your students were aware that you were ill, for your name is often mentioned with fondness by all your former students. And had but one known, I'm certain that all of us would have heard about it. All of us hope that when you are fully recovered, Detroit will be on your itinerary. We'll be looking forward to seeing you. We've bought everything you've recorded in order that my boys will have access to as much as of your work as possible in the years to come. I know what an insight you gave me into the human mind, and I am only sorry that it is not assured that they are going to have the same advantage, Dave. If your cause leaves this earth with you, it will be a great tragedy. I am most sincere." Naturally, these two communications, together with many other of a similar nature, have deeply affected me. These friends, both known and unknown, deserve consideration. So do all the medical practitioners who work so hard to alleviate suffering. So do their patients. If my knowledge can help in any way, this book will have served a fine cause. First, I wish to make clear certain limitations in my discussion of medical topics. I am not a doctor. There are no degrees after my name. Being a layman, I make no claim to medical knowledge. However, several hundred psychiatrists have been my students. Circumstances have enabled me to work with literally thousands of physicians, dentists, and podiatrists. I began teaching doctors the professional use of hypnosis many years ago, and I made it plain to every doctor who attended my class that I have no medical knowledge. All I could teach them was professional hypnosis, and once they knew what could be done with hypnosis, they would have to attach their own knowledge to what I taught them in order to come up with something valuable. This is still the case today. What I offer here is not an exploration into medicine, but a history of my findings in hypnosis. My work with medical men has enabled me to import research. Not long after I began teaching, doctors began asking me to help them with patients who had no organic pathology and yet were quite ill. There was no medical explanation for their illness. Let me give you an example that led to a very important discovery. It was in 1950 that a psychiatrist in one of my classes told me about a woman patient who was suffering severe pain of an unexplained nature. Every medical test has been made, and the test showed the patient was in good health. Yet the pain was intense, and the psychiatrist was at a loss to help. Would hypnosis reveal the cause of her condition? I asked the psychiatrist to bring the woman to my home, and I would see what could be done. I questioned her at a great length and learned that she had not known such a pain prior to an operation for a gallbladder condition. The pain had begun almost immediately after the operation, and yet she recovered from the operation quite easily. I succeeded in getting the patient into the state of hypnosis, known as somnambulism, and learned that her statements were true. There had been no comparable pain prior to the operation, My probing only confirmed what the psychiatrist had already told me. The psychiatrist asked if I would be willing to work again with the same patient at his office. I agreed to do so. When I arrived, he was busy with another case and asked if I would get started with the patient while waiting for him. He left the room and the patient readily accepted the state of somnambulism. We covered much of the same ground, and then it occurred to me that if the pain had only begun after the operation, its cause must be in the operation itself. But the patient had been deeply anesthetized during the surgery. How could I learn what happened in the operating room? I decided to get the woman into a much deeper phase of hypnosis. I call this phase hypno-sleep. Recent research has confirmed the fact that it is a deeper state of hypnosis than has ever been deemed possible. Okay, phase hypno-sleep, deep state of hypnosis. Interesting. Further questioning revealed that she could relive the entire operation, relive it, telling me exactly what had occurred in the operating room while she was unconscious and had apparently lost her sense of hearing. She could tell me exactly what the anesthetist, the surgeon, and his assistant said, even after the chemical anesthesia had taken full effect. One of the things that she had heard, which seemed to affect her violently in the abreaction, the relieving of the experience, was the surgeon had said what they had said after the incision and exposing the gallbladder to view. He had remarked, "Take a look at that gallbladder, she'll never be the same after this." I asked the patient what that statement meant to her, and she answered, "I think it meant that I would never be a well woman after the operation." I explained to her that the doctor really meant this as an encouraging statement, but had unfortunately used the wrong words, that the pain which she was suffering would subside, and before the visit was over, the pain had completely vanished. She was now pain-free from the first time since her operation. Subsequent reports from the psychiatrist were to the effect that the patient was getting along beautifully. It had never occurred to me that a patient could relive what had occurred during complete anesthesia. Like everyone else, I thought that such a patient could neither hear nor remember what was going on around him at the time. Now, inadvertently, I had stumbled upon an amazing fact. Here was a patient who could not only hear under chemical anesthesia, but who could afterward relive the things going on around her during the operation. I decided to see if it was possible to do this with other patients. Perhaps many unexpected illnesses could have been caused by indiscreet remarks made by a surgeon, anesthetist, or nurse during surgery. I induced such patients to relive their operations under hypnosis and give me the details. To my surprise, person after person was able to give me information which he apparently did not have at a conscious level, and upon checking with the doctors, I found this information to be absolutely accurate. I then passed this discovery on to my students, all of whom were doctors, with the suggestion that when treating a patient for illness of unknown origin after surgery, they look to the operating room for the cause. After I obtained sufficient reports from doctors who were able to duplicate what I had done, I began to stress in the classroom that doctors and their assistants should be careful of what they say, even though the patient is unconscious and apparently unable to hear them. It also occurred to me that if the patient could be influenced by unfortunate remarks in the operating room, he could be similarly influenced by good suggestions given to him when he was in deep anesthesia. This made possible the following important finding. The patient can be given suggestions to maintain anesthesia even after the chemical effects of anesthesia are gone, thus making recovery much easier. This was my first important finding in the use of hypnosis. It has been substantiated by many surgeons and psychiatrists. Interestingly, though enough, a few years ago I learned that a doctor on the West Coast was beginning experiments along the same lines and had made similar discoveries. This doctor was not a student of mine, and we didn't meet until 2 years ago. He has sent me several very interesting papers, which have been published in medical journals, again confirming that a patient can hear while under chemical anesthesia. In this connection, I recall an incident that was tape recorded in the classroom. It happened in San Antonio, Texas. I was giving this information to my students when one of the doctors in the class vehemently disagreed with me, but conceded that if what I said was possible, it was an important contribution to medical knowledge. He remarked that a few years previously he had undergone major surgery and didn't have the slightest recollection of what went on after the anesthetic was given to him. I asked him if he would like to relive that operation and learn exactly what happened. He said he would like to try, but didn't believe anything would come of it. I put him in the state which I call hypnosleep and had him relive the operation in detail. During the reaction, he exclaimed, "So that's why they are making such a long incision." After rousing him from the state, we spent the balance of the session discussing this doctor's operation. The things he didn't know about it before, the hypnosis, and the things he knew and understood. He was most enthusiastic. He sent the tape recording he made to the West Coast doctor who was doing research in this area, and has since sent the tape recording to me. A transcript of that hypnosis will be found in a later chapter of this book, when we discuss the phase of hypnosis known as hypnosleep. It will be probably many years before doctors all over the world accept the fact that patients under complete general anesthesia retain their sense of hearing, and that the mind is functioning even if it is at an awareness below the level of consciousness. Yet papers have been written by doctors of excellent repute substantiating these facts, which have been proven in over 200 cases. When mental activity under anesthesia is accepted, it may well lead to further valuable findings. Since the mind functions at a low level below consciousness awareness when the patient is unconscious, it is reasonable to pose this question. Is there any possibility that a person who is made unconscious by an accident or any other means still retains his sense of hearing, and that the victim's mind is still working even though the conscious is below the level of awareness? I believe further research is indicated, though I make no claims that in this writing that this is the case. Before describing a second important finding I made through hypnosis, it is worth mentioning that classroom incidents have been accurately recorded while they were taking place. For several years, my wife, who is an expert at shorthand, transcribed every word said in class. Later, we began tape recording class sessions. In this way, I could review each session privately, learning what doctors needed to know about hypnosis in order to use it effectively. The technique also enabled me to spot any mistakes I might have made in my teaching and correct them during the next class. Let us go now to that second important finding made shortly after I began teaching doctors the professional use of hypnosis. One night, an industrial physician attending the classes announced with a great enthusiasm that in 24 hours, with the use of hypnosis, he had relieved 2 male patients of impotence. The other doctor in class were inclined to scoff at his pronouncement. Still, he insisted that he had already helped both men. Here's what he said. There had been a slight accident at the plant, and I was binding the lesions of one of the victims. As he was leaving the office, he said to me, "I wish you could fix up my real problem as well as you fix up these minor things." I asked him what the real problem was, and he answered impotence, and I've had it for several years. I asked him how it had started, and he told me it began after his first vacation from his wife. He'd gone down to Florida, and while they had had relations with a strange woman and had contracted gonorrhea, he went to a doctor and was quickly cured, but he had such a feeling of guilt that he didn't have the heart to go back home from New Jersey. It was 10 weeks after the doctor told him he was cured before he got up enough nerve to go back to home. When he did, he was unable to resume family relations. He'd had a very unhappy marriage ever since. I hypnotized the man and told him he had punished himself long enough. I stressed that by punishing himself, he was also punishing his wife and destroying a happy marriage. That from now on, he would cease punishing himself and would find himself quite able to resume family relations that very night. Then I brought him out of the somnambulism and gave him a little more encouragement and sent him away. Next morning, he came into my office bringing another man from the plant with him. He said, "Doctor, it worked so well for me. Maybe you can also help my friend. He's got the same trouble and he's had it quite a while." I asked the second man to tell me about his troubles, and he told me I got married a few years ago. I was 45 years old and I was marrying a girl of 21. On our wedding night, the fellows began to kid me. They said I could never make good with a girl of 21, that I was an old bug and couldn't possibly be a real husband for a young girl who was less than half my age. I must have believed them because we've been married for over 4 years and we still haven't been able to consummate our marriage. I put this second patient under somnambulism and went over his story again. And then I told him that he would be as potent as anybody for the rest of his life and that he would be able to consummate his marriage immediately. I roused him from the state, talked to him a bit further about the subject, and he was able to respond to me. The condition was completely corrected and the marriage had been consummated. The doctor told the story so well, in fact, that the doctors changed their attitude and asked me what I knew about using hypnosis to correct impotence. I told them that I knew very little about it, but that if I had been successful in those 2 cases, I might be successful in many instances. I advised them to try it and see. They tried it only on cases where all pathology has been ruled out. Pretty soon, the doctors began to respond successes. They noted that while many cases of impotence are caused by the use of certain medications, by pathology or surgery, about 90% of all impotence has an emotional basis. In those cases where emotional disturbance was to blame, they were successful many times. Occasionally, however, the phone would ring and the doctor would say to me something like, "I worked in 2 cases, but it has not worked at all. On the third man I tried it on. What did I do wrong?" I told these doctors that I hadn't the slightest idea what they'd done wrong, and I didn't know why it had worked for some and not for others. Then they began asking me whether I would come to their offices and see if I could find out why they had occasionally failed. These calls would come in sometimes 3 or 4 a day. When I went to the doctor's offices and watched them work, the reasons for failure became apparent. They were succeeding in almost every case where the patient knew the cause of the impotence at a conscious level, as in the instances already given. They were unsuccessful when the patient was unable to tell the doctor the cause. By means of hypnoanalysis, we then determined the cause of the impotence, and once discovered, the patient's trouble could be readily. The results were spectacular. Soon I was working with more important cases than I could handle. For every time a doctor was unsuccessful, I would be called in to do the hypnoanalysis. I think it was less than a year later that one of the doctors in class asked, "Hypnotic techniques seem to work so well on problems of impotence. Why wouldn't they work equally well with frigidity when there is no pathology present?" Frigidity is, of course, the female counterpart of the male problem. They gave the idea a trial, and the calls began to come in from enthusiastic doctors saying that they had been able to correct frigidity by means of hypnotic techniques. When these reports were made in class, there would always be one or two doctors who would say, "Well, maybe you were successful, but I wasn't. I tried it and it didn't work. What did I do wrong?" It was easy to see that the same situation existed in frigidity as existed in impotence. Whenever the patient knew the cause of the frigidity at conscious level, it was quite easy to relieve, but when the patient was unable to state the cause, the doctors would fail. Again, hypnoanalysis was the answer. A long series of hypnoanalysis began on women, and the results were gratifying. We would uncover the cause of the frigidity, give the patient insight regarding the problem, then bring her out of the state and discuss it thoroughly. One after another, these women were able to report that they were no longer troubled with frigidity. In the first 4 or 5 years of teaching, I never failed to correct an impotence case. The results were not quite so consistent. However, with cases of frigidity, I firmly believe that the reason for my inability to achieve a spectacular results was the natural reserve of the female. A man will reveal all his sexual problems honestly to another man. But a very modest woman, whether she realizes it or not, often holds back information which the doctor vitally needs in order to help her. When a woman doctor is working with frigidity cases, she finds that a woman will tell all of her problems and thus make recovery from frigidity easier to relieve. This has been borne out by many reports I have had from female doctors. There is one doctor in particular who told me quite seriously, "I used to think I was a general practitioner. Now I find that my time is taken up day and night with frigidity problems, and that what you have taught me has enabled me to hit a very high percentage of success." Doctors might well be guided by these findings, namely that after pathology has been ruled out, there are only 2 types of impotence and only 2 types of frigidity. Type A is where the cause of the impotence or frigidity is known at conscious level, and type B is where the cause of the impotence or frigidity is not known at a conscious level, but is retained in the mind by an awareness below of consciousness. It is my belief that these discoveries and others on which I shall report can be well utilized by the doctors who read this book. The public enthusiasm for writings about medicine shows that such findings are also interesting to the layman. I shall therefore describe and document them fully. Among the calls for help that I have received from my students, physicians and dentists, one was particularly interesting. This was the situation as revealed to me over the telephone by an obstetrician. I have a patient in the hospital who has been in a catatonic state for about 72 hours. The woman is pregnant. She is sitting up in bed and none of us seem to be able to get through to her. Several psychiatrists have been called in, and after consultation they decided the only medical treatment that would help her is shock therapy. The mother superior at the hospital is violently opposed to shock therapy in this case because she is under the impression that if the woman is given a number of shock treatments, she will probably miscarry. So she will not permit shock therapy in this case. Is there anything you can do to help this patient? Naturally, I reminded the obstetrician that I was not a doctor and was not supposed to work in a hospital. He said, "Dave, this is an emergency and the psychiatrists have asked me to call you. You are being given permission to work with us, this patient at the hospital under the direction of the psychiatrist and myself. We will be there with you." I didn't know whether I could help this patient, but I was certainly willing to try since it was going to be done under medical supervision. I was shown the patient's hospital chart. I didn't understand it at all, but the obstetrician explained to me just what the data in the chart revealed. He also introduced me to several of the psychiatrists. When the obstetrician and a couple of psychiatrists took me into the room where the patient was sitting upright in bed. She was staring straight ahead at the wall, not moving a muscle, and she didn't even turn her head when I approached her bed. I stood silently for a moment, not knowing what to do. Then I said to her, "You must have had a lot of trouble to put you into such a terrible state." So far as I can remember, that was all I said to her, but I did say it was a very sympathetic voice, in a very sympathetic voice. She slowly turned her head toward me and said, "I have." Then she began to cry. I asked her, "Won't you tell me what the trouble is? Maybe I can help you." She said, "I don't think anybody can help me," and she just went on crying. I said, "Okay, if you will just follow my instructions. Maybe it will be easier for you to talk and tell me what it is bothering you. Would you be willing to follow my instructions?" In the midst of her tears, she said, "I'll do anything if you can help me." I put her into hypnosis and then got the amazing story from her. It seemed that she was the mother of a 3 or 4 year old child. Her husband was a veteran of the Second World War who worked nights, coming home at about 2 a.m. When he was in the army, he had been given a very short leave before being sent overseas. He was only able to be home with his wife for one night. It was on this night that she became pregnant with her first child. Her husband was overseas when the baby was born. Then the war ended and he came home. He began to tease his wife, saying, "Are you sure I'm the father?" He may have said this teasingly, but the wife was never certain whether he was really joking or meant what he said. They lived happily for several years, during which time, whenever he had a few drinks, he would bring up the subject again. Then she became pregnant of a second time, and after several months had passed, went to see the obstetrician to confirm her pregnancy. When the obstetrician told her she was really pregnant, she was very happy. She went home intending to give her husband the good news. Expecting her husband home from work about 2 a.m., she waited up for him, but he didn't come home until 5 o'clock in the morning. He had had a few drinks and was quite high. Before she could tell him about the pregnancy, she asked him what he had kept him so late, and he said to her, "I went to see the doctor today and he gave me some terrible news. The doctor said that I'm not only impotent, but I am completely sterile." Now the poor woman was in a terrible dilemma. What was he going to say about the second baby? That was when she became so emotionally disturbed that she landed in the hospital in a catatonic state. In deep hypnosis, I got to her thoughts. They went something like this: if he was impotent and sterile, how in the world did I get pregnant? He is the only man I've ever been with. What is my husband going to say when he finds out I'm pregnant? The obstetrician and I did our best to placate her, and we told her we would speak to her husband. When we brought her out of the hypnosis, she was no longer catatonic, but she was still a very disturbed woman. The doctor got in touch with her husband, and that night my wife and I, the obstetrician, met the husband in the doctor's home. The doctor questioned him about his impotence and sterility, wanting to know what doctor had given him this diagnosis and when. The husband laughed and said, "I'm not impotent or sterile. No doctor told me that. I got drunk and stayed out too late, and I thought this would be a funny alibi, so I made it up on the way home." The doctor and I were appalled. Then the doctor laced into the husband. He told him the story, this sort of thing was not funny, and of the damage that had been done. By now the husband was upset and kept protesting that he had only been teasing in the same manner as he had teased all these years about his first baby, knowing full well the baby was his. when the doctor said, I'm going to take you over to the hospital and you are going to tell your wife the true story and I'm going to be there to hear you tell it. Result, the woman got well and later delivered a fine, healthy baby. This incident illustrated another important finding, as important as it is simple. There are times when a kind word will break through a patient when all other forms of therapy have failed. Okay, so this is what we expected. The first technique of breaking through a state is here. Very simple one, common one, but one we should definitely remember. There are times when kind words will break through a patient when all other forms of therapy have failed.